Hi, I'm Jennifer Sir. Welcome to the Sewing Room and our Jobs in Fashion series. Today we're going to learn about being a technical designer and talk with my friend Megan Boynton. She and I worked together at The Gap as technical designers years ago, and I know she has lots of great insights. I'm excited for you guys to meet her as well. So without further ado, here is Megan. Megan, welcome to our Jobs in Fashion series. I am so excited that you're here with us today to talk about being a technical designer.
Oh my gosh, thank you so much. And Jennifer, I'm so excited to talk about technical design, mostly because it's like where you and I met, and it's what I've been doing for a shocking amount of time in my life. And I frankly never thought I would be doing it. I should kind of start there. It was not, when I was 19, it was not what my intention was, but I'm so grateful for it. Do you want to should I start like kind of my journey?
Yeah, I would love to hear about your journey, where you got started and where you went to school and yeah, exactly.
How it all came to be. So I always like to start with a little contextual statement, which is I'm pretty old. I'm 50, 51 actually, almost 52. And so I was entering fashion in 88, 89. I moved to New York in 88. And so it was a long time ago. It was before computers, it was before, frankly, fax machines. We just started using fax machines. Um, and I was going to be a designer, and I wanted to be a designer of the ilk of kind of Dior. Now I think about it like, wow, I really had high aspirations. But Dior, Charles, James, Schiaparelli, Alexander McQueen came along, and he just like blew my mind. And so these kind of high couture, high tailored, high three dimensionality visions, art. I really saw it as an expression of art. When I entered the industry, it was a time of foundational kind of stripping down the fancy, stripping back that couturier or that erudite way of dressing. And there was no, I was just thinking like there was no Met Gala, there was no Gaga, there was no ball gowns, right? We were really coming off the 80s, and we were pulling back, and we were going into white t-shirts, khakis, jeans, those types of things. And
And all the simple gowns that Vera Wang did
oh
too,
my God.
all like just clean.
And Calvin, right? These columns,
And
beautiful columns. Um, and I basically thought, I don't, it's not my style. And I don't know how many people need t-shirt designers, right? There was a million of us out there that were churning out t-shirts. And so I recognized that I really needed to understand the business before I could kind of own the business, right? Because if I wanted to have my own business. And so I got a position at Norma Kamali being her domestic production manager. And I was 23. I had no business having the job, but it was an incredible opportunity. And I'm so grateful for it even to this day because it really did teach me how a sketch becomes a commercialized garment, right?
Mhm.
And it really lit a fire in me. At that same time, J. Crew was starting this new role in their company called technical designer, right? And that to me felt such, I was so called to it because my vision of design was always around proportion, pattern, how do we kind of make the body look beautiful within this? What is fit? How does fit work? Right. One
Mhm.
of the interesting things that I experienced as a young person when I was putting myself through school was I had the opportunity to be a fit model. And I had the opportunity to be a fit model for runway shows because I was very thin. And so I would come in and do pre fittings before the actual models would come in. And what that allowed me to do was to sit in a room with the designers of the time, Mark and Isaac, a guy named Gordon Henderson, who's no longer around, and Donna, and basically fit the garments and listen to what they were looking at and looking in the mirror and seeing what they were looking at. So it really infused that process with me. It was no longer sketch, it was sketch and the three dimensionality. And so when J. Crew opened that kind of roll up, I was like, I'm going to get me that role. And did. And quickly learned how to go from I'm going to drape something or I'm going to sketch something to I'm going to write it down on a piece of paper. And it's such a hard transition for my brain to make, um, but did. And it doesn't mean that I ever abandoned the draping or abandoned the pattern making, right? Those were all tools I was using, but I suddenly was having to communicate with a factory at that point in time that was in Alabama or in South Carolina, and then very quickly in Asia. So I had to really learn how to do those things. J. Crew was across the street from Gap. And Gap had a really wonderful woman who and I know and adore, Genevieve. And Genevieve was looking to build the tech design group with Bill in Banana Republic. And so heard about me and said, hey, J. Crew's got a good skill group. Let's interview Meg. She brought me over and Bill said to me, hey, we have 200 pattern makers that we have to turn into technical designers. How are we going to do that? And it was this very interesting kind of moment in my life where I recognized an opportunity, but also an opportunity for the future, because there was a whole bunch of really talented, really skilled masters that were suddenly being forgotten by the industry. And so it became a passion of mine to say, how do we bring these masters into the process, and how do we actually bring them all into the room and retain this, even though we're moving to making things offshore, or even though we are in this foundational kind of highly less structure pulled down garment. And so that's kind of where it started, and then it just blew up and took off, and has been an incredible time since then. One of the interesting things that I find about technical design is you have people like me who kind of go into it from hey, there's a business thing here, there's a design thing here, there's some kind of, need around process here. And then you have people like Anna, like think of Anna Kay, right? Mm-hmm. Who or Jenny Fong. I am a master pattern maker. If the world were 100 years ago, I would have my own shop and I'd be a tailor, right? They'd be on Sevilla Road or something like that. But that's not the world today. So therefore, I'm now working for a large company doing this thing. And there are these kind of two types. And what's been interesting to me to watch is how those two types kind of come together to create this beautiful whole. And so now, kind of at the end of that journey, at the end of almost a 30-year journey, I'm now really interested in how do we empower and almost crowdsource these functions, right? So how do we bring these talents together and leverage technology to, grease the communication, but really like crowdsource it, bring it all to bear on the solution? Because fit is, as you and I both know, fit is the number one reason somebody walks away. So think of it this way. Somebody walks into a store or an Instagram channel nowadays, or TikTok or whatever the new one is. I'm really old. But basically, she or he is like, oh, love the color, love the shape, right? Price is right. So those are 3 reasons for her to walk away. And so you just won her as a brand on 3 reasons. The last thing is, does it fit?
Right.
And if you lose her there, then all the money that the company or you have spent getting through these other hurdles is a waste. And the fit is actually the thing that changes the garment. And that's why I love Dior. That's why I love Charles James. That's why I love these kind of master pattern makers, is because McQueen is the master of that. Right. Valentino right now is doing incredible things that way. And one of the interesting things about that is Donna Karan once said to me, I put on some garment, it was ill-fitting. And she would do this thing in the fitting room where she would stand behind you and put her head here, and she would look into the mirror, right? Because she wanted to understand. She had to see it, right? It was such a brilliant way of doing it. I mean, you and I both know that the best way of fitting is to actually fit in the mirror, to not actually look at the garment, but to look in the mirror, because it makes you look at things.
Yeah.
So she would do this thing, and one time I came out in this outfit, and she's like, darling, you look like a sausage in that, right? And she reflected to her team into the room, hey, listen, when someone, and then I came out with a different garment on, and she's like, look, she's a different person. And she reflected to the room that when a garment fits well, the woman becomes the woman. She comes through. When a
Right.
garment doesn't fit well, you've basically just, you're only serving the garment, and therefore you're not really serving the customer, and you're not getting the right presentation of your
Right
garment. And I
presentation.
loved that. And it really has stuck with me my whole life as I'm kind of looking at fit and proportion. You know, there are so many times, you and I both know there's so many times when you're like, oh my God, I cannot make this same sleeve correction, right? I make it 50 times a day. I can't make it anymore. It's driving me crazy. And yet that's where I always come back to this place of, but that one little correction is the thing that's going to change and make this garment beautiful.
Absolutely. And that brings me to my next question, actually. So you talked a little bit about pattern making and that process, but what exactly is the technical designer's role?
Are
What
you
do they
ready?
do? Like, yeah.
What do you do? What is like what happens? So basically, the way I used to explain it at FIT is the tech designer sits between the designer and the production person and the merchant, sits at this kind of nexus of those three very different competitive ideals and synthesizes them all into a garment. So what that means, like, what do you do on a day-to-day basis? You come in and you are creating specs or developing specs for garments. So specs like the measurements of the garments for development, right? So it's like literally my favorite thing in the whole wide world was when I worked with Jenna Lyons and I were friends, and we worked together at J. Crew back in the day. And she would hand me literally these sketches that were fashion sketches. They had all this movement and beauty and just fun in them, but didn't look like anything. And if we would send that to the factory would make exactly what the sketch looks like, right?
Right.
And so
Yeah.
I would go in and I would say, okay, the measurements need to be X, Y, and Z. And she and I had a nice shorthand where we understood the measurements together so that we could literally go very quickly through it. And many times I would just take the sketch, she would drop the sketches off on my desk before she left for the night. I would take the sketches in the morning, put all my measurements on them, maybe an hour, drop them off at her desk, and she'd just okay them. So sometimes we wouldn't even have a conversation. We'd just be like, yep, 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 trust you. You know what I'm going for. So that kind of foundational element of being able to translate somebody's vision or your own vision into flat specs is a really important thing. That's kind of the first step. The foundation of that comes from really understanding how patterns work.
Right.
When you and I both worked at Gap, we worked for a woman named Doreen Maller. When I first met Doreen and interviewed with Gap, one of the things she said to me is, I'm only looking for people that can, as a master tailor, draw a perfect armhole. And that was a really important lesson for me. I really grabbed that and kept it in my brain, which was, if you cannot visualize, if you cannot draw that armhole, if you don't know what those shapes need to be prior to developing the specs or to fitting the garment, you really are lost, right? And
Right.
so those foundational elements of pattern making matter, like matter a lot. A great example is shoulder slope. So what is a shoulder slope? A shoulder slope is the distance between where your shoulder actually sits and where your neck is, right?
Right.
And there is a distance there, and it's usually an inch to an inch and a half. If you make garments with a new factory in Vietnam or China proper, and they don't know, they will say that you are out of your mind to have such a shallow shoulder slope, right? We usually do an inch, inch and a half, because the Asian, literally in the Asian culture, way back when, and the body was sloped, right? Those garments were very sloped. So often you would get garments to where the neck on the Western customer would be up here, and you'd be like, what is happening? And it's like, oh, it's sitting on her shoulder and it's pushing up. We've got to bring it down. That's like a great example of understanding what a pattern is and where those kind of fit issues can happen. And then last thing, what you're doing as a technical designer is you're kind of developing these specs, you're creating patterns, or you're informing the design with the pattern knowledge you have. And then the last thing you're doing is fitting the garment. And that's kind of the most critical thing. All that other stuff leads up to this kind of moment that you have with a model, hopefully, or sometimes a mannequin, or sometimes nowadays, pandemic over Zoom, where you're literally looking at a garment and making sure it looks like what the designer's vision was, who the merchant's customer is, right?
Right.
At the price that the production person wants. It's a very interesting place. I mean, you and I used to talk all the time about the merchant vision versus the designer vision at Gap Inc., right?
Right.
So basically, I would always say, hey, the designer is designing for Madison Avenue, or nowadays Soho, or or the Met Gala, or somewhere cool like downtown LA. The merchant is selling it in Kansas City, Missouri.
Right. And they're selling it a lot in Kansas City, Missouri. So they really have to sell it to that customer as well as the people on Madison Avenue.
That's
Right.
exactly right.
Right.
And so when you think, and when I used to talk to my students at FIT, I'd say, okay, I just want you to close your eyes and think about this for a second. We have, and this is still relevant today, we have a giant country. The coasts, what do the coasts bring in? The coasts bring in immigrants. So there's always an influx of new thought, new ideas that are coming into the coasts. And then the center of the country is really stabilized, right? It's a very stable kind of salt of the earth, really strong kind of part. It takes a long time for that new to come in. One of the ways we see it deeply is when we talk about bodies and body shapes. And so when you have this kind of new education thought, blah, 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 coming in, we have these trends that happen in body shapes on the coast that take some time to get to body shapes in the middle of the US. And it's not like people have intention around, right? There's all sorts of social political reasons why body shapes are different, including the most important, which is genetics, right? Biology.
Right.
But basically, when you start thinking about that, you really do start thinking about how do these pattern shapes have to differ from that original design so that we can achieve the look, but on this different shape, right? And so it's true just baseline engineering. And then you actually, if you're a really kind of value additive tech designer, you're also always trying to take construction out so that the price is amenable to the customer.
Right. More affordable. And
Yeah. Yeah.
and that's better for the production part of the business, right?
Yes,
Production.
exactly.
And then the merchandisers are happy when they have a better margin on things. So yeah, it's a multifold process. So
And it's a really interesting thing because the tech designers, you've heard me say this before, that I always felt like tech designers didn't understand how influential and powerful they were in their role.
yeah.
And one of the things I used to talk about all the time was, listen, you're the end of the playing field. You are the guy or the gal that's going to kick the ball or throw the ball or whatever across the goal line. So you gotta understand the whole play, and then you're kind of fixing everything at the last minute before it's happening. But fortunately or unfortunately, you have all this influence and power, and you are the person that should raise the red flag or should say, you know what, we can forget this and move on, right?
Right. Yeah. What does a typical day look like in the day of a technical designer?
Oh my gosh. Right. Think of, I was talking to somebody, Jennifer, the other day about our typical day versus the typical day today.
Right.
Different it is, right?
It's really
So
different.
when you and I started, like way back in the day, we would go in and the first 20 minutes of our life was succumbed by the computer logging on.
Right. Right. Because
Right?
we had DOS, right? We had DOS and we had to wait for the computer to warm up. And yeah.
So you're like, I'm gonna get my coffee, I'm gonna chit chat because I'm like waiting for. So truly, like nowadays, when the team, I'm consulting a lot, and when I watch the team come in, the first thing they're doing is jumping on Slack and answering rapid fire questions. That is actually the first thing that you're doing as a technical designer, because what you've done is the night before you've sent information or information has gone out, and you need to actually just answer questions from the factory. Is the button line, which is the size of the button, the right button line? There are all sorts of questions. Or do you want French seaming or do you want this seaming? So there's just kind of this litany of questions that come out. Nowadays, back in your and my time, it was like a giant email or a fax. Nowadays, it's on Slack, it's on multi-channels, I'm on WhatsApp all day long. It kind of comes at you in a million different ways. But that is somewhat your first priority because if you can clear it out, then you can get to the fun work, right? The cool meaty work. Typically, you're either prepping or sending comments from a fitting, right? So most companies have this kind of fixed point in time, either every day or multiple times a week, where a model comes in or multiple models come in, and you can actually fit your garments. So you're often just like chasing those comments. You're either prepping, you're specking garments, or you're commenting on them.
And so
Then,
when you say commenting,
yes.
um, just to clarify, that really means like communicating with the production team or communicating with the factory or who's ever in charge of conveying that information to the factory. So it's a big communication game, right?
It's
Like,
huge.
yeah.
Well, that's exactly what I was going to say. So like, there's this kind of, I don't know if you ever experienced this, but I really experienced this, which is I really had to change my brain and the way it worked to communicate effectively with all the partners, all the business partners that I was communicating with. So like, let's think of like who they are, right? So you have a factory that does a person in a factory that does not speak any English. Like, just
Right.
know that
Right.
there is no English, or there is, but it's conversational. It's not, it's not engineering schematic English, right?
Right.
There's a agent or third party middleman that sits between that person and basically the company, that usually is a product development person or something, adds some kind of value around fabric resourcing, factory resourcing, those types of things. That agent or merchant, sometimes they're called, literally is not only juggling you, but they're juggling, millions of clients, millions of people, right? And they're funneling it to millions of different factories. They're this kind of massive conduit where people come in, 50 people come in, and then they go out to 50 different factories. So again, their time is so precious, and the detail that you need to cover and they have to retain and pass on is critical, and it's impossible to do. It's one of the most impossible tasks. And then you're also writing information for your own internal team to capture what decisions were made in a room around a garment. And so if you think about it, basically you could be fitting, I'm just going to use like a jacket as a good example. So a jacket has like a blazer. Let's take a blazer, right? Because that's a blazer. Do people even call them blazers anymore?
They do.
Like, what are those called now? But blazer has anywhere from 50 to 75 operations, which means 50 to 75 steps in making it.
Right.
That's a lot of steps, right? When you think about that. And the pattern has how many pattern pieces are in a typical blazer?
Like 27 or a lot. Like,
it's a lot, right? It's like so many, because you've got your inner linings, you've got your facings, you've got all your things, right? And there's like 4 or 5 different fabrics. It's like, and then buttons and all the stuff, thread size. And so when you think about that and you're trying to kind of synthesize that information to someone who doesn't speak English, to a factory that's busy, to an agent that's busy, and then also internally, did we all agree on those, what we wanted? Mm-hmm. Did the merchant agree? Did the designer agree? Did the sourcing person agree? And then you have to do it in like a page. Right?
Yeah, the recap.
Right? You gotta recap it. You gotta make it really stick, and you gotta synthesize the information so the most important information is at the top, etc. All of that stuff. And that's a huge part of your day. So one of the things I used to talk to my students about was, hey, if you are not into communicating for whatever reason, like that's just not your bag, this may not be the role for you. Because so much of what you are doing all day long is finding ways of communicating very dense information in the most simple, succinct way so that someone can act upon it. Absolutely. And what I've found often is drawing is everything. Drawing and photos are everything. So one of the things that you're doing on your daily basis is like literally making drawings and photos and things like that to explain these processes.
Right, especially for people who don't speak English, where you may need extra visuals to show them what's going on with the garment.
Yeah. The other thing that's really important, and some companies are like this, some are not, but I will say the majority in my experience are. One of the things that we had to do as an industry, just as a tech designer or designer creative, is the industry said, financially, just made better business sense, we're not going to take liability of our inventory until a certain period of time, until it's all made.
Mhm.
right? And so that's actually still very common, which means the company does not send the factory money until which time the factory is done making the product. And then at that point in time, if the product doesn't look like or work like or stand up to wear and tear like we are expecting, there's an enormous conversation, right, that happens because the factory has invested a lot of money and the company's invested a lot of time and energy. And if it doesn't work out when we've actually looked at the final product, it's a big problem, right? It's like,
Right.
if you think about it, it's like how much of your day did you often spend in troubleshooting those problems? And it does happen. It happens because humans make garments, right? Humans
Right.
make garments. I just say that over and over again. Humans make garments, and there is no, well, there's some stuff that's coming out, but it's like, it's so new and different that we're going to be in the humans make garments for at least another 20, 30 years, right?
Right.
And so mistakes happen, and we allow for those mistakes, but sometimes those mistakes are foundational to the garment.
Right. Mhm.
One of the things that I've always talked to tech designers about, because all of us want to just control that process, and especially if we're good pattern makers, we just say, oh, well, I'll just make the pattern. The moment we do things like that, where we introduce a pattern into the process, one of the things that happens is we are now liable for the ultimate end product. It's a really interesting thing. There's two primary tools that you communicate with your factories, which is one, a spec sheet, right? Some people will call it a spec, some people will call it a tech pack. It just is basically measurements, a bill of material, which basically means the trims and foundations that are on your garment, and color. And these comments that you and I are talking about, and direction on pattern and direction on construction. You know, what threads are you using where? How are they stitching? Those things. When we tell them people those things in a tech pack, they have costed a garment based on that, and they've tried to follow it to the best of their ability. The moment we introduce things like patterns or gradedness, like I had a tech designer recently being like, "I'll just do the grade," and it was like, "Ooh, time out," right? Because what happens is now we've told the factory, and the factory is just going to use our thing. We think that's the right choice because we're like, oh, but I'm good at this. I know what I'm doing here. The challenge is that the way the garment is made in a manufacturing setting is very different than you would ever think it is made.
Right.
And even people that are incredibly experienced, that have kind of grown up in factories and become tech designers, actually miss that very foundational point, which is the factory itself, the sifu or the master pattern maker in the factory itself is the expert. And so your job as a tech designer is to really understand where their strengths are, where they need support, and to communicate effectively to that factory in that way.
Mhm.
And that's, you're doing it all, literally, you're doing it all in email and or WhatsApp, right? You're doing it all through words on paper. And so those drawings become really important. But I often tell tech designers to draw but not dictate pattern, because you're you're making an assumption about how the thing is made that may not be correct.
Right. Right. Yeah. Can you tell me, are there any seasonal changes in the daily work routine of a technical designer?
Thank you for asking that. So one of the things that I should have said is that a lot of tech designers, a lot of companies, you own multiple product categories. So what that means is, hey, when I was a tech designer, I owned cut and sew knits, women's cut and sew knits. So a women's product, cut and sew knits, right? That's easy. But I also owned sweaters, right?
Totally different.
Right. Totally, like made in a completely, like, first of all, not cut. Like we don't cut sweaters, right? We knit them, and we don't sew sweaters. Well, now there's cupping stitch, but for a long time we didn't sew sweaters. We knit them, and so it was a very different mindset.
Mm.
From a corporate perspective, though, if you have somebody that's doing sweaters, really that means their workload is really front ended towards the summer. We do most of our work on sweaters in the summer.
Yeah.
So what are they doing in the winter? So often sweater tech designers also own swim. It's a very odd little
Interesting.
combination, right? So if you work for a company that's a sweater and swim company, you own these like very different things. Mostly because also you recognize that a knit garment is different than a woven garment. And so the way in which you talk to the factory, the way in which everything is completely different.
Yeah,
The
the
way in which you build
vocabulary
it,
is different, right?
yeah, your vocabulary is different, everything. And so that, so I would say on average, when I was doing that, I had probably anywhere from 50 to 60 garments, styles in the pipeline at any given time that I was managing, right?
Right.
And so some were in development, some were finalizing, which means I was fitting them and I was signing off on the fitting and feeling good about the construction, fitting, etc. But that's all. It's a lot, and the seasonality really matters because the biggest points in time in the retail calendar are, hopefully this is going to change. I'm actually hoping this is going to change with this pandemic and difference, but are May. You're doing an incredible amount of work in May. And the reason why is if you count from May, the fifth month, 6 months out, which is kind of total end-to-end life cycle of the product, right?
Yeah.
You're in November. What
Right.
happens in November? Black Friday, Cyber Monday,
Right.
right? So
Right.
you're really busy in May. And then you're really busy also in December. And this is the thing that I know you and I probably even talked about. When you're managing or leading tech design groups, this is the hardest thing.
Yeah.
So you're very, very busy the month of December because again, 6 months out, it's June, it's spring. Like you're launching spring. You're also bringing in fall, the first product for fall in
Right.
July. And so you are incredibly busy from the 1st of December until the 24th of December. Like it is intense. And one of the things that's very difficult for tech designers as they're coming up is that because we will say as bosses, hey guys, it's going to get really, real busy and it's going to be busy from December 1st until December 24th. Please don't take vacations. So there is this odd thing that happens in tech design where you're kicking off the process because you're doing development, you're giving them their first measurements on how to make that garment. And then you're also finalizing the product, right? You're fitting the product, you're making sure it delivers on time, you're making sure the construction is correct. And so you have these big kind of moments of enormous amount of work that happen at these big times. There are other littler times. So there's another kind of big time in September, and that's always hard because many of us are moms or have families, and so there's back to school that's happening, but you're also like jamming against some
Yeah.
deliverables. It's and they all kind of meet these really odd times just out in society, right? Like September, like the worst time ever. December, the worst time ever. Like Hanukkah, Christmas, like holidays, right? May, the worst time ever. It's like Memorial Day, school's ending. So it's very, very difficult. Now, I will say, that being said, there are also times where people will say, take all the vacation, take all the time and do it. And I would say to my team often, do it. Like do it because right now we have it. Take it. Like if you're leaving at 3, awesome. I don't care. Right? Because I'm going to ask you to stay until 10, but I'm going to ask you to stay pretty late in December. So there are seasonal peaks and valleys, and it is a part of your job to actually be available during those peaks and valleys.
Right.
But do it eyes open and ask when you're interviewing, ask like, where are those peaks and valleys? What are the blackout times? Like, what do I need to be aware of? Because they are there, and a lot of hiring managers won't bring them up if you don't ask.
Do you ever travel as a technical designer?
Yes, we do. We travel a lot. It's interesting. So there are 2 tracks. There are technical designers that don't travel at all. And they are clear. They'll say, I don't travel. And it's just because, either new kid or anxiety. I mean, there's all the reasons. And that's okay. But I will say that traveling it's a benefit. If you think of it that way, it's a benefit to your job. One, you get to meet incredible people, like just incredible people that you would never, ever meet if you didn't travel. Master pattern maker sitting in a factory in the middle of China. And it's just incredible who you can meet, how you can engage with them, and what you can see. You also get to see the process, which is great because then you can always be more effective, right? So if you're seeing that process, you can always be way more effective. Because you can end run things, or you can say, oh, I see that coming. I'm going to help with that. And then the last thing is, I was super fortunate and I got to travel the world on Gap's dime for 3 years of my life. And it was incredible, right? You and I went to India. We
went
so
to
much
India.
fun, right? Think
It
about
was so
that.
much fun. It was so much fun, and it was also terrifying. But it was
Right.
great. Yeah.
Right. really fun, terrifying, and really stinky, many, many times stinky, but also amazing, right? And we were there at a time that, I mean, India is, I don't know if you've been back, but it's so different now, right? Like, and, or I was saying to some students of mine, I have this picture that I used to show students of mine that was Beijing when I first started going to Beijing. And every street was uh, bicycles and rickshaws. Most streets were bicycles, rickshaws, and city buses. And now Beijing is Teslas and,
Wow.
Bentleys and Porsches and not a bike to be seen. And same with Guangzhou. When I first started going to Shenzhen, a friend of mine said it was a fishing village. It's like, it wasn't a fishing village, it was like a fishing town though, right? And now it's like four San Franciscos stacked into one amazing, giant, beautiful, robust place. So you see all of this stuff. You really get a chance to engage with the world. And you also confront some really odd situations, right?
Right, right. Like the cattle in the middle of the street. That was
Yeah.
really an odd situation that I will never forget.
Yep. Like we're
Well,
just going to have to sit here because there's a herd of cattle in the middle of the street.
yeah.
Um, Also, like think of where, were you with me? You didn't go to Egypt with me. So that same trip when I went to Egypt, we were driving out to a factory out between Cairo and Alexandria. So it was like maybe like a hour and a half, 2 hour drive. And we drove out and I was with Ashish, who was our QA person. And suddenly I look out the window and there's like, a little kind of village, like roadsidey place, right? A couple of town, like houses and things like that, but not a place. And I look and I was like, oh my gosh, there's all these white shirts hanging on a line, drying, right?
Garment washing.
And I'm like, who's this? And he's like, and suddenly she turns. I'm like, fantastic. We're not where we're supposed to go, but like, cool, this is an adventure. And they are our garments that they are line drying because they've been garment washed.
Wow. Yeah.
Right? And who is line drying them but the women who literally historically have been line drying garments for the, in that village from the beginning of time. And they were hanging outside in the Egyptian air. Right?
They're gonna dry, right? Yeah.
But it's like, that's amazing, right? That is truly amazing to say, oh my gosh, the person that's picking this up in a Gap store has no concept that this garment, it was touched by 50, 50 plus people, is hanging, was hanging in the wind in Alexandria, right? Like,
Right.
it's like amazing to me. And that as a tech designer, you get to see. But also there's, it's exhausting and it's exhausting at the same time. Do it young, travel young.
Yeah, that was one of my favorite parts about being a designer was meeting all the different people and seeing how many people actually touch the garment. Like when I tell my students, your garment may have been factory sewn, but it was sewn by people, and it could have been a lot of people
Yeah.
sewed the garments. Like someone sewed that collar, someone sewed the waistband, someone sewed the cuff.
Right? We
Yeah,
have to do that. Yeah.
and so, yeah, that's something I don't think a lot of people understand is how many people are involved in the process of making your clothing. And
Thousands and thousands and it's so interesting to me when you walk through these factories that are football, the size of football fields, right?
mhm.
And some of them are like as immaculate as a hospital. I mean, they're so clean and so beautiful and so like wow. But think of that, just when you think about that, it's like a football field, a hangar full of people
Right.
sewing. So every time you kind of think like, oh, I don't want to pay $6 for my underwear, right? Think of how it was made. Somebody literally sewed that thing,
Yeah.
right? My favorite thing from a just a social political perspective, but I talk about it a lot because I want to connect the dots for people, and tech designers really do have a good perspective on this. Once I heard about, I saw a news thing about a woman who bought a dress at Topshop for 20 US dollars, the equivalent of 20 US dollars. In that dress was a label sewn that said, help me.
Wow.
And she was on the news saying, I can't believe Topshop did this and blah, 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 right? She went on and on and on, and her intentions were absolutely in the right place. But her impact on that statement was not that impactful. And what I wanted her to recognize in that moment, if I could have done, is you paid $20. what did you expect?
Right.
Right? And
Right.
so I
Yeah.
think one of the things that tech designers really have a unique position on is really understanding that trade-off right there. And how can we make those trade-offs? And how can we make that dress for $20 without kind of asking for too much work or taking too much labor or sacrificing paying people, right? Like how can we do that? And there are ways, but you have to kind of be creative that way. And I think tech designers are the future in that because I think they are the people that really understand all the inputs and all the inner workings of a garment. And
Yes.
they get to see all the places too.
They get to see all the places too. Yeah. So Megan, thank you so much.
No, I'm sorry I went on so long, Jennifer. I'm so sorry.
No worries.
As
You
usual,
had
I
a
hope you
lot
enjoyed
of
it.
you had a lot of really wonderful things to say, and so many questions came up that I would love to talk to you more about, like sustainable fashion and what that means. But for today, I think we're going to stop with technical designer.
Oh, the one thing I did want to say was nowadays, what I'm so excited about is programs like yours, programs like FT, programs like Savannah, like all of that. Like everybody has really incredible programs now around technical design. And when you and I were coming up, there wasn't. And
Nothing.
so I really think that is just an incredible asset and people should take those classes like FITM, FIT. I mean, everybody has programs now and people should do it. And even if you're like, I don't want to be a tech designer, I want to be a designer, or I don't want to be a tech designer, I want to be a merchant, take it. As you know, you and I both know, one of the things that was so successful at Gap is that we actually did put all of our sourcing and merchandising people through a technical design briefing, right?
Right.
And it really enabled them to understand the inputs and outputs when they were having conversations at the table. So, yay, I'm glad you guys are doing it, and I'm so glad that it's out there. I'm thrilled. I'm very
Good.
excited.
We're having a good time teaching these folks how to make patterns and what tech packs are and all of the things around fashion. So anyways, well, thank you so much for coming and showing up
Yeah,
here today. I had a great time and I
thank
really
you.
appreciate you taking the time out to do this with us.